Hi everybody. I just welcome to the UX, a cornerstone of business strategy and digital transformation webinar. Just to give you a quick bit of intro to myself, I'm Niall Diggins. I'm a UX consultant with version 1. Um, so let's get into the webinar. So I like to start off a lot of these slides with just specifying that any questions should be sent to myself, Niall Diggins at version1.com, and any questions that are asked in the chat will also be logged, and we can send you a message after the conference if there's not enough time at the end to go through those specific questions. Okay, let's get into the presentation. So up on the screen right now is a legacy application that many people might recognize. So it's the Motor Tax Online historical website. So we actually engaged with the Department of Transport pretty early on and took on the user experience challenge. And I just wanted to show you a realistic view of what interacting with a UX team, a service-led design team, can offer straight off the bat. So here's the historic image, and here's what it's changed to. So as you can see, it's obviously changed vastly over time, and larger buttons, more impactful imagery, better text and brand information has been incorporated into a site like this. So that's just to give you a flavor of what happens when you engage with a UX team. And so now let's get into, well, what does that engagement actually look like? So if you think good design is expensive, you should look at the cost of bad design. And again, here's an image on the left-hand side of that original interaction with the motor tax, with the Department of Transport, and how that changed from a desktop view shown before and is now showing a mobile view. But what we're really saying here is, just because sometimes design seems expensive, you shouldn't look at that cost, I suppose, as a single entity. That cost can be spread across different things. So how does that approach work? So user experience design is just one element within a kind of a service-led design package. So if you think of anything from infrastructure or solution architecture all the way to user experience and business analysis, all of it has a focal point of UI and visual design. So when you're talking to an end user, most of them are interacting at that UI visual design that point with an application or a product. At the next level up, they're interacting with it on a device. So that device could be a phone, or it could be a tablet, it could be your Xbox. And then at the next level up, you're interacting with that technology. So is that technology Angular? Is it React? Is it a SharePoint website? Is it .NET or PHP? And so we're building in those business objectives, those business rules, and user experience goals at that level, at that interaction level. And then above that again is the service design and business design. So service design really talks about understanding the portfolio of applications that that you as an organization might have. So we're not talking about that one-off application that needs just a revamp, but what we want to do is understand that whole ecosystem of applications and build in consistencies. So when we're talking, how does that approach look like? Well, our approach specifies that strategy is required, and strategy can be, solution architecture strategy, it can be infrastructure strategy. In the service design strategy, it's happening at the same time. It's happening when the first concept of a product revitalization or application modernization or a new application is being discussed. And at that point, you can align your business goals and business objectives with user experience goals. And you do that by doing specific things like research and analysis, design and prototyping, evaluating and testing, and developing information and code with that user-centric approach. So all the time, once we've passed that first initial understanding of what the strategy should be, we're focusing on the end user, the person who's going to be using that technology, that application. Because at the end of the day, those business goals that you have understood and required at an early stage will only be delivered if those end users can deliver them. And eventually we launch. So it's a very similar approach to an agile or waterfall, where in agile you do this incrementally, but in waterfall you would do this as a big design up front. So it can work within either. And really what we're trying to do with that approach is turn uncertainty into clarity and focus. So that uncertainty on the left-hand side, all those squiggles and scribbles, that's how people engage. They look at a problem and they go, oh, I'm not sure about that problem. I think this is how we should look. This business rule is now setting how we should engage. When people don't necessarily understand why that business rule is there. It could be technology led from 10 years ago that it says you must engage with a certain task or process in a specific way. But if that was technologically led historically, that can change with new development. So it's trying to change that uncertainty and understand those business rules in the modern world, and then move that into a clarity and focus on the right hand side. And you want to develop in that clarity and focus. You want to understand why you specifically are developing a piece of application or a feature or a user story. So when we're doing that approach, when we're in that research phase, what we want to do is understand a number of factors that influence UX. And some of these are based on the GDS standards in the UK. It's kind of a more simplistic view of those standards. So we're saying something needs to be findable, usable, and valuable. So findable really means that you use the same design patterns where possible. You allow people to get familiar with the product, to understand how it works. If you're talking about a historical application that's moving to a new application, you try and understand how somebody worked previously, so that in the new world, on a new application, they don't have a kind of a first-time user remorse, that buyer remorse. They're engaged straight away. That's what you want to get. In terms of usability, the usability is directly tied into findable, but it also says it's not necessarily how they just interact with that interface, but also from a technical level. If you expect them to move from one application to another or from one technology to another, have you built in that navigation and that understanding at that system level? And then with value, we're saying that the product must deliver a value. We're not saying that it has to be the most cost-effective, cheapest product. We're saying, what does value look like to a business? Is it a person trying to buy a book and you're trying to improve the ability for someone to buy a book, similar to how Amazon has brought in that one-click buy option? Or are you trying to make a person within an organization more effective? So are you trying to reduce the amount of, I suppose, blockers from within their specific workflow? And then the other three are useful, desirable, and accessible. And we'll see more about accessibility coming down the line, specifically because of an EU directive. So there's an EU directive 2102/2016, and that's the European web accessibility guidelines for public sector, and it'll turn into private sector over time. And what that engagement looks like is that they're telling people to follow the WCAG 2.0 AA standard guidelines. And that has an impact for both developers and for content managers and content creators. So you have to look at it from how do we develop this software in a way that allows people with accessibility requirements to work through that system as easily as possible, but also from a content side of things, are we developing content like images and understanding that the people that are looking at those images or wanting to interact with them may have, I suppose, requirements that mean that it just cannot be a single image. It might need alternate text to describe it. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about accessibility design. And then useful and desirable. Well, desirable specifies kind of branding and aesthetics and emotional design. And so here we're really saying that just because something is an internal application that's used by 10 people doesn't mean that you shouldn't throw your brand on it, your logo on it. Doesn't mean you can't develop that to be aesthetically pleasing to work with, and that you can't incorporate core values within your company into that design. So if you're a company that works with children, you can allow some level of fun possibly within the design. If you're a company that works with restaurants and bars, you can bring in, colors that are within a bar, imagery that makes you feel like, you're connected with that brand within that internal application. And usefulness is really trying to understand the context. So are you using something on a phone, or are you using something on a desktop? And what differences does that mean? So I'm going to break down those areas further, and specifying value proposition first. So when we talk about value proposition, there's a, an area called TVM, so time, value, money, and it's the understanding that if you have money now, even though you might make more money in the future, that ability to have it now and use it now is more important and more crucial. However, when we're talking about user experience, a lot of people don't realize that that cost of associating that cost of associating a UX consultant at an early stage may help your company to reduce costs or reduce the amount of time associated to specific business processes at a later stage. So what you're saying is, not only are you making the overall project possibly more valuable, you're also increasing the efficiency and effectiveness of each one of your staff. We've recently worked on a project where we engaged with a very specific business process that took 14 clicks for an initial engagement of an application. It took 28 for the second, and it took 42 for the third. So it's an increasing by 14 clicks each time. When we tried to understand that process, we said, well, look, we can reduce the impact or reduce the overall effort required from 14 for the first click down to 8, and each further application will just need one further click. So when it was taking 42 for 3 applications, it was now taking 10 for 3 applications. So that's an overall reduction of 75% effort that each member of staff had to use for that specific process. If you take that across a company, if you had the ability to reduce people's workloads by 75%, well, that's a huge increase in value for each staff. And that's where we talk about with value proposition. We try and understand those key business processes that we can reduce the amount of effort required for your staff to engage with, and therefore we decrease the amount of cost associated with that task and increase value. So here's a quote from Paul Rand, and Paul Rand is a visual designer, an artist, and he states that the public is more familiar with bad design than good design, and therefore it is conditioned to like bad design. When we talk about what bad design is, it just means that people are so used to engaging with products that have a very specific look and feel and work model that they've actually built work processes and flows around those applications, rather than having companies, look at those applications and saying we're improving them. People build out manual workflows to understand how we can work through this application better. So when we look at current applications, this becomes more and more apparent. So people become reassured by that old infrastructure, that old application, and therefore when they see or hear that people are going to create a new application, they all of a sudden feel threatened. And it's something to look for when we're talking about creating new applications. So the first thing to do here when we're talking about reassuring people is ensure that you build for your users. So understand the context of how people use information or use applications, understand the device that they're using, understand the interface that they need to, and be purposeful with their page layouts. So on the left-hand side here, you'll see a phone. And if everyone picks up their phone now and they try to have it in their hand and they try to reach that top left-hand corner, if you're right-handed, you'll find it difficult. And Facebook originally put their log out button in that top left-hand corner. They intentionally made it more difficult for people to log out so that they were always on Facebook. And when we try and look at something like this, we actually try and use that easy zone. So is there an application that requires people to press a button on a phone? If yes, try and have it within that easy to okay zone. Don't have it in that hard. Don't make life harder for people trying to complete a task. And when we say create consistency and use common UIs, we emphasize the idea of frameworks, either utilizing something like Fabric UI or Angular Material, or creating your own if you have a number of bespoke applications. So what you creating your own might look like is, having a UI developer create a form. And so if you have 2, 3, 4 different types of applications, you utilize that same form across each one. So when somebody is interacting with that application, they have a consistent user experience throughout if they have to input information. Similar with buttons. If you use a green button to be an action somewhere that says submit, don't on another application use a blue button. And it's ensuring that consistency and that use of common UI elements allows people to feel more reassured when they're using an application. And then the final bits are, with typography and creating a hierarchy, you don't want to emphasize that different size fonts or different colors emphasize importance. That's bad in terms of accessibility. So you want things to be legible and readable and understood easily. And then finally, with that system communication, like you want to ensure that people understand when errors happen, when they've done positive things. So either positive or negative reassurance that says, look, this hasn't happened or this has. I was given the example before that it's like a fire alarm. When you're in a building and you hear a fire alarm go off, everybody knows that a fire alarm has happened and understand that they should leave the building. Whereas if you're in traffic and someone beeps, everybody looks around and tries to understand, was that person beeping at me? That context of that beep is now lost and no one understands who's made an error. So it's putting context to system communications and ensuring people know what's happening. On this slide, the importance of flow is crucial when you're developing an application. And so when we talk about flow, we're talking about adaptability, productivity, and focus. So flow is the navigation, whether it's transparent or whether it's, I suppose, in the background of how someone should interact and move through an application. And when we talk about flow, it's understanding, building on that context from those previous slides so that a specific user may need a specific flow and specifically design screens to move from one area to another. So if you're trying to get somebody to complete a specific task, or they have a work process where they need to complete a number of tasks in order to complete that entire process, you build a flow that allows them to get from point A, which is the start, to point Z, which might be the end, as seamlessly as possible. So when we talk about flow, I often think of a jug of water. And if you have a jug of water and it's full, that's your users. And if you have a table or something hard, a hard surface, and that often is your application. So without understanding flows and without understanding users, people build applications and expect users to know how to use them. So the idea here is you pick up your jug of water and you tip it over and pour water onto that table. Without the right context and understanding of how users are meant to interact with that application, and without building flows in order to corral them into the correct locations, you end up getting a splash and water goes everywhere. So that's exactly what we don't want when we're talking about building new applications or modernizing current applications. If you then look at that table and say, well, let's build in grooves throughout, and let's now pour that water on top of the table, but emphasize that those grooves, that water goes into those grooves. Now you've corralled water, you've placed it into very specific locations. And so that's exactly what you want when you're looking at an application. You want that water to go in very specific directions. And if there's interlocking requirements or work streams, you build in those streams into those grooves and allow people to interact throughout. Here we talk about the context of that flow. So those flows may have a very specific pattern and a very specific direction, but it doesn't mean that depending on that device that you're using or where you're using that information, it can't look different. So on the top here, you see that we have a flow that requires people to make a payment, where a desktop screen by nature of being larger allows people to see more information, whereas a mobile screen may not. So what we're saying here is, depending on the context of your application, we're specifying whether you can do everything on one screen or whether it should be broken out into two screens. So that context of device and user and navigation all comes to a head when you're interacting with that UI on a screen. So here's just a quick view of some UX tools that we use here internally in version 1 when building these applications. And these are different levels of engagements. So we're talking about information architecture, that's understanding the context and content of how you want to interact with people. So whether it's articles, whether it's imagery, videos, whether it's an application that requires manual input, things like data analysis and process flow analysis goes in towards the kind of business analysis and objective setting side of things. And then prototyping, whether it's high fidelity or low fidelity, is a layer of engagement that allows customers to kind of say, well, yes, that's exactly what we want. So my last slide, so I allow people to ask questions if they want in the chat, so I might have some time towards the end. But the benefits of UX design, and it's somewhat of a loaded question, but the aim of UX is to reduce risk, to increase productivity, to engage with users and businesses, and to offer more business value. And they're core areas that UX has the ability to affect. It reduces risk by understanding business objectives and aligning them to UX goals. It increases productivity by understanding those objectives and understanding those processes and placing them in the best workflow possible to ensure that you can decrease the amount of time associated with those. It engages with users and understands the challenges of onboarding onto new applications, and it champions users to ensure that when they do get access to a new application, maybe it's at a step-by-step process that allows them to learn as they go, whether it's with a first-time experience or whether it's with continuous first-time experience or different levels of onboarding. And then it allows that to the business to understand where potential value is. So without necessarily understanding how people interact with certain processes throughout the business, it's hard to define where there is value available. So by understanding that, you have the ability to bring value to an area that possibly wasn't understood before. So increasing your call center's efficiency by 10% adds value in that area. So that's my final slide. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them in GoTo now, and if I have time, I'll get through them. Or you can also connect with me directly via nialldiggins@version1.com.